This is Austin Liti Limits, where authors talk to authors about books and the craft of storytelling. Sponsored by Blue Ink Review, because typing the end is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com. In this episode, Scott talks with Deesha Philyaw. Deesha grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and if she hadn't turned into an award-winning author, she might be giving top chefs a run for their money because she's a great cook. As it is, her collection of short stories, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, won the 2021 PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction, the Story Prize, and was a 2020 finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. The book focuses on Black women, sex, and the Black church, and is being adapted for television by HBO Max.
Please welcome to the show, Deesha Philyaw.
Thank you, Scott. Happy to be here.
Happy to be here. So what's this exotic background you have going on here?
Oh, it's just the screen to hide all the junk in my bedroom.
I know. So Deesha is the author of this excellent collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. I was put on to you by an excellent profile in slate.com. And I actually purchased your book for my wife at the time because I thought, well, she would love to read this. And then she said, you need to read this book. It's fantastic.
Oh, wow.
So I read it and it is a fantastic book. But I was struck by a comment in the interview about the characters of your book. And you had said that after being dissatisfied with choices you had made in your life, that you, quote, I gave my discontent to my characters. Mm-hmm. Was this something you were thinking about at the time when you were writing, or is this just something that you've discovered on reflection now that you have a collection out in the world?
In between, when I first started writing, I wasn't aware that that's what I was doing. And then somewhere probably in the mid 2000s or so, at some point where, you have to write I had to write an artist statement, which a lot of artists don't like to write artist statements. But, if you're applying for grants and things like that, they'll ask you to write something. And, you're supposed to talk about what you write and or what you create, what is your art. And it occurred to me when I tried to sum it up, I said, I write about dissatisfied women, that's the through line. And then, in more recent years, probably, before my collection came out, I realized, oh yeah, I was pretty unhappy when I started writing. And but I wasn't comfortable writing it as essay or nonfiction. There were times when during those years where I journaled and I look back at those journals and I was like, there's so much I wasn't saying. And so I didn't give my exact dissatisfaction to the characters, but that sense of a repeated thing was, you have all of this, or you've done everything right. You've been a good girl. You follow the rules and you're dissatisfied. So that kept coming up over and over again. But I couldn't articulate it, I think, until I got to the point where I was starting to sort of heal and sort of, make a path for myself towards greater satisfaction.
So let's talk about the time when you wrote a lot of these stories and you had some upheaval in your life. And I know you went through a divorce, and I've been through a divorce. Two.
Yeah.
Well, you win. I only had one. Let's talk about, trying to make space in your life for writing when you're going through something like that. One of the novels I wrote a few years ago, both my grandparents died in the middle, and I took a 9-month break where I didn't write at all. And it seemed like a real uphill battle just to get back into that groove. Can you talk about having to deal with that type of upheaval in your life and then still trying to write?
I think the closest parallel for me would actually be the deaths of my mother and my grandmother, because my divorces were more beginnings than endings for me. It was moving towards that, away from the dissatisfaction towards, healing. And so it wasn't the divorces that sort of, kind of threw me for a loop as a writer, but it was in 2005. That one year, my mother and my grandmother who raised me, they both died. And then my father, who had been kind of in my life, but not really, he also died that year. And so, everybody's conventional wisdom for a writer is, if you're going, whatever you're going through, write about it. It's cathartic. And that's just not true for everybody. And so I didn't want to write about my mother or my father, kind of in an on the nose way, personal essay, memoir, that kind of thing. But fiction was a way that I kept writing. And it was like, but this is the piece I've saved for me. This is my sanctuary. And so neither the divorces nor those deaths sort of threw me off in that way, but gave me a greater sense of urgency, actually, especially with my mother and my grandmother passing away. My mother was only 52 when she died
Oh, wow.
of breast cancer, and I just felt like, oh, I don't have any time to waste. I can't, I can't have imposter syndrome. I can't worry if people are gonna like this, or I can't worry about what the church is gonna say, or
Mm,
whatever, or what people are gonna think if I write, these sex scenes. Like, I just didn't want to go through my life looking back, wishing that I had done things, and wishing I had more time to do things. I'm like, I have to act like tomorrow's not promised. I have to write like that. And I still didn't do it as much as I wanted to, because I was in a position of also trying to make a living writing and editing, and what we call in the freelance world, like the patchwork quilt of income, of teach, adjuncting, like all the things you're doing
right.
to keep food on the table. And then, oh, there's this fiction that hopefully maybe someday will get out into the world. So I was writing all sorts of things. And then starting like 20 years ago, I initially was working on novels, and there were like 3 attempts at novels, and there's one that I think still has some legs that maybe one day will see the light of day. But I was writing everything else. I was writing for magazines and newspapers. I was writing personal essays, and when I could steal the time, I was writing stories. The novel just really confounded me, mostly because I didn't know how to write a novel. Still figuring
Mm.
that out. But the stories, kind of flowed more easily. And then I took a huge detour with my first ex-husband, and we wrote a book on co-parenting.
Hmm.
And so that's how I landed an agent. And she knew that I had a novel that I was working on. And so she said, whenever you're ready with the novel, I'm ready, to send it out into the world. But I wasn't finishing, but I was writing these stories, and she would read the stories, and she had the idea that then, the stories could become a collection. So the deaths probably should have slowed me down more, just in a holistic kind of way, looking back. Um, but they gave me more urgency around the writing.
It's really interesting you say that, because I had the exact same epiphany when my grandparents died, and they died 4 weeks apart.
Oh,
And
sorry.
after, sounds like you had a year, 2005, mine was 2015,
Mm,
where I didn't write for 9 months. And then when I kind of stood back up and was like, I'm ready to write again, I had that same thought. Life's short. I need to get on it.
yeah.
I got a lot of stuff I
Yeah.
need to write, and I need to get to work. So it's very interesting. So I loved all the stories in your book, but my absolute favorite one, which not, I've read a lot about your work, and a lot of people mention Peach Cobbler, but
Hmm.
Snowfall is my favorite story in your book. Snowfall made me cry.
Mm,
Uh, in fact, thinking about it right now, I just feel like crying. But there's this tension in the story that is marvelous. And the tension is that Rhonda and Lily are away from their home. They reminisce
hmm.
about their mothers and their aunties and the people back in the community where they lived. But since they're a couple, they've been ostracized. And so there's
Yeah.
this tension between the nostalgia of their youth
Hmm.
and the fact that there's prejudice coming from their families because they're a couple, these two women.
Mhm.
Can you talk about that tension, and what were you working with in your mind when you were writing the story with those two elements?
So the story, often when I start writing, all the time when I start writing, I don't know where I'm going. I usually know, there's a voice or there's something I see, and it's like, okay, I'm writing to discover, to kind of figure it out.
Hmm.
And so when I first started drafting Snowfall, I, I had the first line, which is Black women weren't meant to shovel snow. I just fell in love with that line. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so of course now I've got to have some Black women shoveling snow. And so initially in the first draft, both Rhonda and Arletha are outside, clearing the walk and clearing off the cars so that they can go to work. And, they're talking back and forth, and it became apparent to me. I was like, okay, they're a couple, you know, and that's about as far as let's see, I had them get to, sort of, this is where we came from, and we hate the cold, and it's miserable, and we
Mm.
have to do this every morning. And then that was as far as I got. And I moved on to other things. And so fast forward, I don't remember how much time it passed, but a couple of things happened. I knew that I was working on building a collection, because so initially when I started Snowfall, I hadn't, my agent hadn't suggested a collection. But when I came back to it, I knew that I was working around these themes of Black women, sex, and the Black church. And also, I had been invited to be part of a reading by my friend Abir Haq, whose memoir had come out, Olive Witch. And she was born in Nigeria to Bangladeshi parents and then moved to Pittsburgh. So she, place is really big in her work, and
Mm-hmm.
belonging and home. And so she was having a book launch here in Pittsburgh. And you know how writers are doing it now, where it's like, she's the headliner and, you're the
Mm.
opening act. So there was going to be me and a writer named Tuhin Das, who is a Bangladeshi writer in exile here in Pittsburgh at City of Asylum. And he's a poet. And so I didn't have to write anything that matched, their work, but I wanted there to be something unifying. And so I thought about Tuhin's work, I thought about Abir's work, and this idea of home and displacement, and where is home, and when you don't feel at home. And I thought about my story that I hadn't yet, called Snowfall. And I was like, Pittsburgh, I've been here almost half my life at that point, hasn't felt like home, in part because of the cold. I'm from Florida, and I really hate the winters here. I hate everything about it. Like, I'm not even, don't mince words about it. And it feels, it's kept me from feeling like I have my place here. And at the same time, I had lost my mother, and these things. So when I revisited that story, it's like, okay, this is a story about these two women, and where is home for them.
Mm.
They have been displaced, in some ways voluntarily, because they chose to leave the South, but also because, as you pointed out, they have been rejected by their families. So how do you make a new home in a place that doesn't feel like home? Can a person be home? Should we make homes out of people? And what is fair to ask of them?
Mm.
And so those are the kinds of questions that either I was, some of them were at the outset when I dove back into that story, and then some of them emerged as the story unfolded. But one of the key differences, you might recall, is that in the final version of the story, only Rhonda's outside shoveling the snow
Right.
at first, and Arletha's inside,
Yeah.
not wanting to deal with it. And so that became the first tension between them. And then it just sort of unfolded from there.
Right. So what about the notion that there is no going home for them?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's that longing, right? They're thinking about the food and the big family events, but they know that the possibility of going home is very slim. It's not going to be
Right.
the same no matter what, because her relationship with her mother's tainted now, right? There's no
Yeah.
going back. So how did you
And
think about wrestling with that notion at the end of the story?
I think it's this idea of how multiple things can be true, right? So totally giving spoilers, but everything you said just now is true about her relationship with her mother. And when she slipped and, busted her ass on the ice, the first thing she thought was, I want my mother,
Yes, right. We're
and
all like that, right?
isn't that so primal? And,
Yeah.
my relationship with my mother was so complicated and so difficult.
Mm,
And in many ways, my mother wasn't who I needed her to be, but there, especially in this time of pandemic and so many hard things happening, I so often think, gosh, I want my mom. Gosh, I want my mom, and my mother used to drive me absolutely insane,
I bet.
So it's that, and I don't mean to liken that to, when your parents absolutely reject you for who you are, because my mother never did that. But these just really complicated relationships, and how can we, if we can, stay in complicated relationships. So for Arletha and Rhonda, Arletha is kind of thinking, I could have this sort of, you know, thinner relationship with my mother. I think about what Toni Morrison said about how thin love ain't no love at all, but that's what that kind of feels like, where I can
Mm,
have this relationship with my mother where we at least talk to each other. I have to pretend like the most important person in my life doesn't exist, but there's this longing that I have for her. And then Rhonda is saying, go for it, because at least you have that, because Rhonda had nothing,
right.
and so how there are just no easy answers. And that wasn't me saying that that's what we should do, because if another person said, if my parent doesn't accept my partner, I want nothing to do with them, that's valid too.
Right.
I think it's just that, we're grappling with these questions, and I think we have to give ourselves and other people the grace and the space to grapple, rather than saying it should be so easy, it should be so simple. Because the people who hurt us, we still do long for them, because we're just connected.
Right. One of the things I think about a lot is there's this advice that you hear from the publishing world as a writer, is that you should know your audience.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have imagined that you'd be talking to a white guy from Texas that loves your book? I mean, it's but good stories, they translate to people.
And Toni Morrison told us that, August Wilson told us that. There are always those connection points in stories that don't center us,
Right.
but seeking out those stories. And some of my favorite reactions to the book have been from men, and my friend Damon Young, we were in conversation about my book, and he said, men are garnish in this book. And I love that analogy, because
Right.
on a meal, garnish is on the plate. It's just
Mm,
not the meal, and I just think how often do we, depending on whatever kind of privilege we have, do we read books where people without our privilege are centered, and so if I'm a cisgender person, how often am I reading narratives where trans people are centered and telling their own stories, and how important is that, because those connection points are there. We just have to be willing to look for them,
right.
and to experience them, and to show up, to these texts, um, and not do it in a way that flattens it, right? And I'm so thankful, because I was really dreading somebody saying, people are just people, we're all the same. And it's like, no, we don't have to all be the same to still have certain things that connect us, like mother-daughter relationships, or
Mm,
dealing with religious dogma, or dealing with parents who reject us, or dealing with grief, or any number of things that are just the human experience. So that's, again, that two things at once. We can be different people, different experiences, living in a society that, places value on those differences, and people are treated differently. And, we are fundamentally human. I don't think we have to pick one and flatten the other.
you are correct. So I love a well-crafted simile or metaphor, and you have a fabulous one in Peach Cobbler. So let me set this up a little bit for anyone who hasn't read the story. So Peach Cobbler is about a young girl whose mother is having an affair with a minister. She lures him to the house with a peach cobbler that the young girl can't have. So she's denied the peach cobbler. And she relates to the minister as being like God because, of course, he's a minister in the church. But she also hears her mother say, "Oh God," from the other room when they're talking. So here's the fantastic simile. So she said, "God was an old fat man like a black Santa." And I remember when I first read this line, I burst out laughing because it's a very visual, evocative line. There's so much going on with that. And so can you talk a little bit about writing that line, thinking of it, I don't even know where to begin with it because there's just so much going on with it. Can you talk about that line a little bit and what it meant to you when you were writing that?
Sure. For that whole section of the story where Olivia, the main character, the young girl, there's a period of time because the affair goes on for a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
And early on, she thinks that the pastor is God because she's been at church and probably, heard sermons or he's reading from the Bible. And a lot of the Bible is God or Jesus speaking in the first person. And so it's easy to conflate, God and the pastor. And I've had moments like that when I was young about the nature of God and the reverence that people showed pastors made it really easy for a kid to think, oh, that's God, because we're treating these people like God. So that was the first part. And I sort of re-inhabited that space of my own childhood confusion and naivete. I also was very literal, as children are. So God is up in the sky, God is in heaven. And I would sit on my front steps and look up in the sky at the clouds and imagine, oh, there's the beard, oh, there's the nose,
Mm-hmm.
So this question of who is God, was very real for me as a child. And so I inhabited that for Olivia, figuring, she's confused. And then this God is coming into her house and eating at her kitchen table, so she is, eventually it just becomes kind of old hat. And then, and she watches him and he doesn't offer her any of the peach cobbler and he's a big man. And so she's, drawing on things that will make this make sense in her world, so if God is a person who comes to your house every Monday, sits down at your table, and he's big and he doesn't offer you any, you're thinking about Santa, who is also mystical and
right.
So you're making these comparisons as a child to things that are real to you, and so Santa would still be very real to her at that time. So I didn't conflate God and Santa as a child, but I was definitely trying to make sense of a material God amongst all of the ethereal things that I was hearing. And it, I didn't process it exactly, but, I remember being on a bus going somewhere with a Pentecostal church group, because I was with all kinds of churches when I was little. I was always being sent places. And I was being a little kid and bouncing around, and I bumped the chair of the person in front of me. And there was like a hush that came over because I had bumped the pastor and I knocked his hat off his head. And you would have thought that I had like smacked God in the back of the head. So to me, these things were very natural, that God could actually be a person among us.
Right. All right, Deesha Philyaw, thank you so much for being on the show. Your book, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, is excellent. Everyone go out and buy a copy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
This has been a presentation of Austin Liti Limits, made possible with help from our good friends at Blue Ink Review, where typing "the end" is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com.